any of you would comment on this? Back in '05, when Congress was here discussing some other legislation and what have you, and the housing market was going pretty well, strong and what have you, can any of you do, I know we heard the recitation earlier to the late Ed Gramlich, who was making his predictions. Can any of you reference us to your comments or papers predicting that in '07 that the market would be where it is today, that the balloon would have bust as it did, and that we'd be in this significant credit problem as we find ourselves today? Who predicted this on the panel?
In July and August of 2006, I wrote a series of articles arguing that we'll experience the worst U.S. housing recession in the last 50 years, that home prices would fall from peak to trough by at least 20%, and that this housing recession is going to lead to a severe credit crunch and eventually a recession. So, and it was not just me, there were several other people in academia and otherwise that predicted that this was just a housing bubble like we've never seen in U.S. history. If you look at the second edition of the book by Bob Schiller, Rational Exuberance, there is a chart showing the real home prices for the United States for the last 120 years. It's kind of like a flat chart with some booms and busts, 10-20%. Since '97, this chart shows that the real home prices go up by 100%.
Okay.
If this was not a bubble, I don't know what's a bubble. It was bound to go bust.
Mr. Paul.
There you go. Thank you very much. My question is directed to Dr. Roubini, but first off, I want to say once again that I have a little trouble with this assumption that if we have poor information sent out to us in the marketplace from the Federal Reserve with distortion of interest rates, that regulation is all that we need that will solve all these problems, because mistakes are made by investors and savers, mainly because they're getting bad information. But I wanted to address a subject with Dr. Roubini. In his written comments, he says the perception by markets that the Fed is trying to avoid necessary economic correction and the necessary adjustment in asset prices is something that I think is what's going on right now, and so important, because when there is a distortion, the market says correct, but because of the emotional and political aspect of people losing a house, you know, it's virtually impossible. Nobody wants to take that position because it looks like you're being cold-hearted. Yet at the same time, when the pretense is that we're going to save everybody's home, frequently when we're demanding lower interest rates, we know that behind the scenes what we're really doing is propping up Wall Street. Every time there's an announcement of significance with interest rates, the stock market pops up, and that seems to me to be the real goal, is to bail out Wall Street, because the people continue to lose their homes. But my question is related to a later statement that you said here. The Fed has now altogether ignored concern about moral hazard and concerns about future inflation, and now starting to undermine the credibility of the Fed. And I think that is also true. But what I'd like to ask about is, when should we be concerned about that? After we have this crisis develop and the bubble seems to be unwinding, where in your estimation does the bubble come from? And when was your concern about the housing market? Was it after we saw two years ago or so that this thing was collapsing, or was this something that you were able to predict, and were you concerned about it when overnight rates were 1% and we could get mortgages once again down at 4% in this age of fiat money where there's zero amount of savings? This is astounding. In capitalism, capital comes from savings, but we have no savings, and yet you could go out and get a mortgage, $500,000, $100,000, $1 million mortgage, and pay under 5% for this. Did you have concern at that time about what the Fed was doing, and would you accept the premise that much of the mischief and the bubbles come from the Federal Reserve? If not, where do the bubbles come from?
You're asking a set of very important and interesting questions. If I have to try to explain how we got into this housing bubble, I think there are a variety of factors. I think there is a consensus now that the Fed cut rates and kept them too low for too long. If you're using, for example, the Taylor rule that Professor Taylor has developed, probably you should have started raising rates much faster than they did after the 2001 recession. So certainly easy money was part of the story. Part of it was also a global condition that kept long-term interest rates low, this bond market conundrum that Chairman Greens was referring to, that depends on global conditions like the relative supply of savings in the global economy relative to investment. So that was a factor that kept the long rates low in nominal and real terms. But in my view, even more so the monetary policy was a failure of regulatory policy, because if you're expecting home prices to go up by, say, 20-30% per year, having a Fed fund that is 100 basis points higher is not going to make much of a difference. And that's where the regulatory failure came, because literally allowing things like zero down payments, like not verifying the income and the assets and the jobs, these ninja or liar loans, having interest rate only loans, having negative amortization where you're paying even less than the interest and then the mortgage value was going up over time, introducing teaser rates, these hybrid ARMs. These were forms of financial innovation that were dangerous and were reckless. And Governor Gramlich and others early on suggested these things were things that we should have avoided. And unfortunately, Chairman Greenspan was the biggest cheerleader for these forms of financial innovation that led us in trouble. So the Fed made mistakes both in terms of monetary policy and in terms of regulatory policy. It was not just the Fed. There was an entire attitude, I fear, in Washington the last few years, in which essentially we wanted to de-emphasize any form of regulation. There was this kind of laissez-faire ideology. The markets know better. But we know in financial markets, people are greedy, and greed is good in some sense. It leads to entrepreneurship, but has to be controlled by institutions, rules, and regulation. Otherwise, financial markets become a jungle where you have asset bubbles and credit bubbles, and when these occur and they go bust, the economic consequences are severe.